Sometimes the most profound truths come from the most unexpected sources. When you've built your life on reading people and making calculated decisions, you believe you can spot deception from a mile away. But on that autumn evening, as champagne glasses clinked and laughter echoed through his marble halls, millionaire Robert Hawthorne had no idea his perfectly orchestrated world was about to shatter. A small hand tugged at his sleeve. "She's stealing. From you," the little girl whispered, her eyes wide with certainty. He smiled politely, patting her head before sending her back to play. Children and their imaginations. Yet as the party continued, something gnawed at him. The antique clock that should have been on the mantle, the nervous fidgeting of his most trusted aide. How long had he been blind to what was happening under his own roof? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mahogany floor of Robert Hawthorne's study, illuminating dust motes that danced in the autumn light. He sat behind his grandfather's desk, the same desk where 3 generations of Hawthorne men had built their fortunes, running his fingers along the worn leather edges of the family ledger. The book felt heavier these days, weighted not just with numbers, but with the responsibility of maintaining what his father had started. At precisely 7 o'clock, Margaret knocked and entered with his morning coffee, prepared exactly as he'd taken it for the past 20 years. 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in the china cup his late wife had given him on their 10th anniversary. Margaret's silver hair was pulled back in the same efficient bun she'd worn since the day she'd answered his advertisement for a head of household. Back then, she'd been a widow with a young daughter, desperate for stable work. He'd taken a chance on her, and she'd never given him reason to regret it. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, setting the cup on its usual coaster. "I trust you slept well after the party." Robert looked up from the ledger, studying her face. 20 years of morning greetings, 20 years of perfectly brewed coffee, 20 years of trust. "Well enough, Margaret, though I noticed the Regence clock wasn't on the mantle last night." A flicker crossed her features, so quick he might have imagined it. "Yes, sir. I sent it to Harrington's for cleaning last week. That old mechanism needs attention every few years, as you know. It should be back by Thursday." "Of course." He nodded, returning his attention to the ledger. "Please ask James to come by after breakfast. We need to review the quarterly reports." "Certainly." "Sir, will there be anything else?" "That's all, Margaret, thank you." She left with her usual quiet efficiency, closing the door with barely a sound. Robert sipped his coffee and tried to focus on the columns of numbers before him, but his mind kept drifting to the party, to that strange child with her earnest eyes and peculiar warning. The Hawthorne estate sprawled across 40 acres of prime, Connecticut land, a testament to both old money carefully preserved and new wealth strategically acquired. Robert's father, William Hawthorne, had started with a small textile factory and a dream. When Robert inherited the struggling business, at 25, fresh out of Harvard Business School, most expected him to sell. Instead, he'd diversified, modernized, and built an empire that spanned real estate, technology investments, and international trade. But success had come at a price. Catherine, his beloved wife, had passed 10 years ago, taking with her the warmth that had once filled these halls. Their daughter lived in London now, pursuing her own career, visiting only at Christmas. The estate, for all its grandeur, had become a beautiful prison of sorts, populated by staff who'd become his surrogate family. Elena appeared at 8:30 sharp, her heels clicking against the marble foyer as she approached his study. His personal assistant for 5 years, she'd been recommended by James, his financial advisor. Young, ambitious, and frighteningly efficient, Elena had quickly made herself indispensable. She managed his calendar, coordinated his charitable work, and served as a buffer between him and the endless stream of people who wanted something from Robert Hawthorne. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, tablet already in hand. "Shall we review today's schedule?" "In a moment, Elena." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Tell me, did you enjoy the party last night?" She sat, crossing her legs with practiced poise. "Very much, sir. You always host the most elegant events, though I did notice you seemed distracted toward the end of the evening." "Did I?" Robert leaned back in his chair. "I suppose I was thinking about some irregularities in the accounts." This time the reaction was unmistakable. Elena's fingers tightened on her tablet, her knuckles whitening briefly before she forced herself to relax. "Irregularities, sir? I haven't noticed anything in the reports James has been sending. Perhaps I'm being overly cautious. It's probably nothing. Small discrepancies in some of the household expenses. A few thousand here and there. Nothing significant in the grand scheme of things." "Would you like me to look into it?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady but her eyes avoiding his. "No need. I'll discuss it with James when he arrives. Now, about today's schedule." As Elena rattled off his appointments, Robert found himself studying her more carefully than he had in years. When had she started wearing such expensive jewelry? That watch looked new, and Swiss if he wasn't mistaken. The subtle designer touches in her wardrobe that he'd attributed to good taste now seemed to whisper of resources beyond her salary. James arrived at 9, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing the same type of conservative suit he'd favored for the 15 years he'd been managing the Hawthorne finances. He'd come recommended by Robert's father's advisor, a man of impeccable credentials and cautious investment strategies that had served the family well through multiple economic downturns. "Robert," James said, settling into the familiar chair. Elena had vacated. "I have the quarterly reports you requested. Overall, we're showing strong growth across most portfolios, though I do recommend we consider reallocating some of the international holdings given the current climate." Robert accepted the bound reports, flipping through pages of numbers that should have told a clear story. But something felt off, like a melody played with one note slightly out of tune. "James, I've been noticing some discrepancies in the household. Accounts, small amounts but consistent. Have you seen anything unusual?" James adjusted his glasses, a gesture Robert had seen 1,000 times when his advisor was buying time to think. "Household accounts? Those would primarily go through Margaret. And Elena, wouldn't they? I handle the investment side, as you know, but I could certainly take a look if you'd like." "I'd appreciate that. It's probably nothing, but you didn't build this empire by ignoring your instincts," James finished, offering a thin smile. "I'll review everything this afternoon and have a report for you by end of day tomorrow." After James left, Robert found himself alone with his thoughts and the lingering echo of a child's whisper. He rose from his desk and walked to the mantle where the clock should have been. The space it left seemed larger than the clock itself, a void that drew the eye and refused to be ignored. The ledger lay open on his desk, and he returned to it with renewed focus. His father had started this book the day he'd opened the factory, recording every transaction in his careful script. Robert had continued the tradition, though most of the actual bookkeeping was now digital. Still, he liked the tactile connection to his history, the weight of the pen in his hand as he noted significant decisions and milestones. But as he reviewed recent entries, he noticed something odd. Some of the ink looked different, slightly newer, as if certain figures had been altered. He pulled out a magnifying glass, feeling slightly foolish but unable to shake the growing unease. There, a 7 that might have once been a 4. And there, an added 0 that didn't quite match the original handwriting. The alterations were subtle, professional even. Someone had taken great care to match his writing style. But Robert knew his own hand as well as he knew his own face, and these changes, while expertly done, were changes nonetheless. He closed the ledger and locked it in his desk drawer, pocketing the key. Then he walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds where gardeners were already at work, preparing the beds for winter. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even. But beneath the surface he could feel the first cracks forming in the foundation. of his carefully ordered world. That evening, as he dressed for dinner, Robert made a decision. He would investigate quietly, carefully, without alerting anyone to his suspicions. After all, these people were more than employees. They were the closest thing to family he had left. He owed them the benefit of the doubt. But as he descended the grand staircase to the dining room, he couldn't shake the memory of that little girl's eyes, wide with certainty and something else, fear perhaps, or sorrow. Children saw things. Adults missed, unburdened by social contracts and willing blindness. Perhaps it was time he started seeing with fresh eyes too. The party resumed its elegant rhythm after the child's interruption, but Robert found himself moving through his own celebration like a ghost. He smiled at the right moments, laughed at the appropriate jokes, and played the gracious host with practiced ease. Yet his eyes kept drifting to the empty space on the mantle, and his mind kept replaying those 5 words. "She's stealing from you." The little girl had vanished as quickly as she'd appeared, melting back into the crowd of guests before he could ask her name or find her parents. She'd worn a simple blue dress, her dark hair in careful braids. Someone had taken care with her appearance, but she wasn't familiar. Not the child of any regular guests or staff members he recognized. Robert excused himself from a conversation about market volatility and made his way to his study. He needed a moment of quiet, a chance to think clearly. The room welcomed him, with its familiar scent of leather and old books, a sanctuary within his own home. He poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter and settled into his reading chair. That's when he saw it. A piece of paper slipped under the door. So far. Under it was almost hidden beneath the Persian rug. He set down his glass and retrieved what appeared to be a child's drawing, done in crayon on plain white paper. The drawing showed a house. His house, clearly, with its distinctive turrets and wraparound porch, rendered in purple crayon. Stick figures populated the scene. A tall man in what might have been a suit, several smaller figures in various colors. But one figure stood out, colored entirely in black, except for bright red hands. This figure was shown carrying bags away from the house, bags with dollar signs drawn on them in green. Robert studied the drawing, his lawyer's mind cataloging details. The black figure was positioned near what might be the servant's entrance. The red hands, blood on her hands, a child's interpretation of guilt, and those money bags, so crudely obvious yet disturbingly direct in their message. A knock interrupted his analysis. "Come in," he called, quickly folding the drawing and slipping it into his jacket pocket. Margaret entered with a tray. "I thought you might like some coffee, sir. You seemed tired at the party." "That's thoughtful of you, Margaret." He watched her set the tray on the side table, noticed the slight tremor in her hands. "Actually, I was just thinking about the Regence. Clock. Harrington's, you said?" "Yes, sir. They specialize in antique timepieces. Funny, I called them last month about my pocket watch. They mentioned they were booked solid through December." The tremor became more pronounced. The coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "Did I say Harrington's? I meant Henderson's. I always confuse the two." "Henderson's closed 2 years ago, Margaret." The owner retired. She straightened slowly, her face a mask of forced calm. "Then I must have sent it to that new place in Hartford. You know how my memory gets sometimes. I'll check my records and let you know exactly where it is." "Please do." Robert kept his voice gentle, even as his heart sank. 20 years of mornings, 20 years of trust, and now this clumsy web of lies. After Margaret left, he returned to the party, but found himself observing rather than participating. Elena circulated among the guests with her usual efficiency, but now he noticed things he'd overlooked before. The way she whispered urgently to James near the terrace doors, the nervous glance she shot toward the study, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked in his direction. As midnight approached and guests began their farewells, Robert positioned himself where he could watch the side entrance to the house. If someone was stealing, they'd need access to areas guests wouldn't normally see. The servants' stairs, the back hallways, the old silver vault in the basement that he'd converted to store financial documents. That's when he saw her again, the little girl. She stood half-hidden behind a potted palm, still in her blue dress, but now wearing a coat too large for her small frame. Their eyes met across the crowded foyer, and she raised one finger to her lips in a gesture for silence. Then, with deliberate slowness, she pointed. Robert followed her finger to where Elena stood bidding goodbye to some guests. His assistant looked perfect as always. Professional smile, appropriate small talk, every inch the dedicated employee. But the child kept pointing, insistent, until Elena must have felt the weight of their combined gaze. She turned, saw Robert watching her, saw the child pointing, and her face went white. The moment stretched between them, taut as a wire. Then Elena forced a laugh, said something to the guests, and hurried toward the kitchen. The little girl tugged on her too large coat and slipped out the front door before Robert could follow. He spent the next hour seeing off the remaining guests, his mind racing. The child knew something, had tried to tell him something specific. But who was she, and why did she care what happened to his money? When the last guest departed and the staff began cleaning up, Robert made his excuses and retired to his study. He pulled out the drawing again, studying it by lamplight. There in the corner he'd missed before, tiny letters in purple crayon. SG. Initials? A signature? He walked to his desk and unlocked the drawer where he kept the ledger. Everything appeared normal, but he'd learned not to trust appearances. He pulled out several files at random. Household expenses, staff payments, maintenance costs. Line by line, he began to review them, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might confirm his growing suspicions. It was nearly 3 a.m. when he found it. A payment to a cleaning service he didn't recognize. Then another to a catering company for an event he didn't remember. Small amounts, a few thousand here and there, but regular monthly going back at least 2 years. He cross-referenced with his calendar. The dates didn't match any actual events. The cleaning service didn't exist in any directory he could find. The catering company's address led to an empty lot in Bridgeport, ghost transactions. Someone was siphoning money through fake vendors, and they'd been doing it right under his nose. The very people he trusted to watch his finances were stealing them, penny by penny, dollar by dollar, counting on his wealth to hide their theft and his trust to blind him to it. Robert closed the files and locked them away. Tomorrow, he would begin investigating in earnest. But tonight, he had one more thing to do. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, documenting everything he'd discovered, everything he suspected. If something happened to him, and given what he was uncovering, that wasn't impossible, someone would need to know the truth. As dawn broke over the estate, Robert sealed the letter and locked it in his private safe. Then he went to the window and watched the sun rise over his kingdom, wondering how much of it was already gone. The morning after his late-night discoveries, Robert moved through his routine with calculated normalcy. He took his coffee from Margaret with the same grateful nod, reviewed the day's schedule with Elena with the same attention to detail, and met with James about portfolio performance with the same focused interest. But beneath the familiar rhythms, his mind worked furiously, cataloguing every gesture, every glance, every word that might betray the conspiracy he was beginning to uncover. His first stop after breakfast was the security office in the estate's East Wing. Tom Bradley, his security chief, was a former police detective who'd taken the private sector job for better hours and pay. Robert had always appreciated Tom's methodical nature and attention to detail. Now he hoped those qualities would help him understand the scope of what he was facing. "Morning, Tom," Robert said, closing the door behind him. "I need to review some security footage from the past few weeks. Routine check, nothing urgent." Tom's weathered face showed mild surprise. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. Any particular areas of interest? Let's start with the study and the main hallways leading to it. Say, the last month." Tom turned to his bank of monitors and began pulling up files. "I can get you the last 2 weeks easily. Anything older than that has been archived to make room on the servers." "Archived where?" "External drives in the basement storage. Elena usually handles the transfer every month. Says it's more efficient than keeping everything on the main system." Robert kept his expression neutral, even as another piece clicked into place. "I see. Well, let's start with what we have." They spent the next hour reviewing footage, Robert making mental notes of patterns and timings. Everything seemed normal during business hours, staff moving through their routines, deliveries being made, the ordinary flow of a large household. But there were gaps, significant gaps. "Tom, what happened here?" Robert pointed to a timestamp, showing 2:47 a.m., 2 weeks prior. The footage jumped from the empty hallway directly to 4:15 a.m., still empty. Tom frowned, clicking through the files. "That's odd. Looks like a system glitch. We've had a few of those lately." Elena mentioned something about needing to upgrade the software. "Show me the other glitches." As Tom pulled up the incidents, a pattern emerged. The gaps always occurred between 2 and 4 a.m., always affected cameras covering the study and the financial records room, and always happened on nights when Robert was away or had taken his sleeping medication early. "Tom, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to keep it absolutely confidential. Can you do that?" The former detective's eyes sharpened. "You're the boss, Mr. Hawthorne. What do you need? Check the system logs. See who accessed the security system during those gaps. And Tom, don't mention this to anyone, especially not Elena or Margaret." Tom nodded slowly. "Understood. Give me a few hours." Robert left the security office and made his way to the basement storage area. If the archived footage was stored there, he needed to see it before anyone realized he was investigating. The basement was a maze of rooms filled with decades of accumulation, furniture from his grandmother's era, boxes of his daughter's childhood belongings, filing cabinets from his father's time. He found the storage room Tom had mentioned, but the door was locked. Robert tried his master key, but it didn't work. The lock had been changed. He made a mental note and continued his exploration, eventually finding himself in the old silver vault. He'd converted it years ago into a climate-controlled document storage area. Tax returns, contracts, investment papers, decades of financial history lined the shelves in neat banker's boxes. Everything appeared orderly, but Robert had learned not to trust appearances. He pulled a box at random, household expenses from 5 years ago. Flipping through, he found what he was looking for: more ghost transactions. A landscaping company that had supposedly maintained the grounds while the regular crew was on vacation. A temp agency that had provided staff for a party that never happened. Always small amounts, always just below the threshold that would trigger additional scrutiny. But something else caught his eye. In the margins of one invoice, someone had made notations in pencil, a code of some kind. Letters and numbers that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant something to someone. "Mr. Hawthorne." Robert spun around to find Elena standing in the doorway, her face carefully composed. "Elena, I didn't hear you come down. I was looking for you. You have a call from the London office." She glanced at the open box in his hands. "Is everything all right? If you need help finding something, just doing some year-end preparation. Tax season will be here before we know it." He closed the box and returned it to its shelf. "I'll take the call in my study." Elena nodded, but her eyes lingered on the storage shelves. "Of course, I'll transfer it now." As Robert climbed the stairs, he felt her watching him. The call from London was routine, a minor issue with a shipping contract, but it gave him time to think. Elena had found him too quickly, had known exactly where to look. Either she'd been watching him, or someone had told her where he was. After the call, Robert sat at his desk and pulled out a legal pad. He began creating a timeline, mapping out what he knew. The ghost transactions went back at least 5 years. The security footage had been tampered with systematically. Someone had changed the locks on storage areas containing financial records. The amounts stolen were significant, but carefully calibrated to avoid detection. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was a long-term, carefully orchestrated theft by people who understood his habits, his trust, his blind spots. His phone buzzed. A text from Tom. "Found something. Can you come back?" Robert returned to the security office where Tom had pulled up system logs on his screen. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to lines of code. "Every time there's a gap in the footage, someone accessed the system using Margaret's override code. But here's the interesting part. The access always came from the IP address associated with Elena's computer. So either Margaret gave Elena her code, or they're working together," Tom finished. "Mr. Hawthorne, I've been a cop for 20 years. This has all the hallmarks of an inside job and not a small one." Robert sank into a chair. "I need more evidence before I act. Can you recover any of the deleted footage?" "Maybe. I've got a guy who specializes in data recovery." "Want me to call him?" "Do it. But Tom, absolute discretion. If they realize we're onto them, they'll either run or try to cover their tracks better." "I get it. What about bringing in the police?" "Not yet. I need to understand the full scope first." "And?" Robert paused, thinking of Margaret's 20 years of service, of Elena's efficiency, of James's steady guidance. "I need to understand why." That afternoon, Robert made a decision. He called his lawyer, not the firm that handled his regular business, but an old friend from law school who specialized in financial crimes. "Paul, I need your help," he said when his friend answered. "I think I'm being robbed by my own staff, and I need someone I can trust to help me figure out how bad it is." "Jesus, Robert, how long has this been going on?" "Years, possibly. Can you recommend a forensic accountant? Someone who can work quietly?" "I know just the person. When do you want to start?" "Yesterday." As the sun set over his estate, Robert stood at his office window, watching the staff go about their evening routines. Margaret directed the dinner preparations with her usual precision. Elena's car was still in the driveway, her office light burning as she worked late. James had left an hour ago, briefcase in hand, same as always. From the outside, everything looked normal. But Robert now knew that termites had been eating away at his foundation for years, and the structure he'd thought solid was riddled with holes. The question was, how much was left, and could anything be salvaged? He thought again of the little girl, her earnest face and urgent warning. Tomorrow, he would find out who she was and why she'd tried to help him. But tonight, he had work to do. He returned to his desk and began the painstaking process of documenting everything he'd discovered, building the case that would eventually bring the truth to light. The Hawthorne fortune had been built on trust and careful planning. Now, Robert would use those same tools to uncover how badly that trust had been betrayed. The forensic accountant Paul recommended arrived at the estate early on a Tuesday morning, disguised as a tax consultant. Sarah Chen was a small woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, carrying a briefcase that contained sophisticated financial analysis software rather than tax forms. Robert had told his staff he was preparing for an early audit, a lie that contained enough truth to be believed. "We'll work in the pool house," Robert told her, leading her across the grounds. "I've had it set up as a temporary office, less chance of interruption there." Sarah nodded, already taking in the details of the estate with an investigator's eye. "In my experience, Mr. Hawthorne, the bigger the house, the more places to hide secrets. How many people have access to your financial systems?" "Too many, I'm beginning to realize." They spent the morning establishing a baseline, with Robert providing passwords and access codes, while Sarah began her digital excavation. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up records, cross-referencing accounts, following money trails that twisted and turned like a maze. "Your instincts were correct," she said after 3 hours of intensive work. "There's definitely a pattern of systematic theft here, but it's more sophisticated than simple embezzlement. Someone has created an entire shadow structure of fake vendors, shell companies, and offshore accounts. This took planning, patience, and inside knowledge." "How much?" Robert asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I'll need more time to be certain, but based on what I'm seeing, we're talking millions, maybe 8 to 10 million over the past 5 years. Robert felt the number hit him like a physical blow. Not because he couldn't afford the loss, his wealth could absorb it, but because of what it represented. Years of deception by people he'd considered family. A knock on the pool house door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he could see Margaret standing outside, holding a tea service on a silver tray. "Hide the screens," he whispered to Sarah, who quickly switched to her innocuous tax form. "Come in, Margaret," Robert called. She entered with her usual grace, but Robert noticed the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down the tray. "I thought you might like some refreshment. You've been out here all morning." "That's thoughtful of you." "Margaret, this is Ms. Chen from the tax consultancy." Margaret nodded politely, but her eyes darted to the papers spread across the table. "Will you be working through lunch, sir?" "Yes, I believe so. We have quite a bit to cover. I'll have something sent out." She paused at the door, turning back. "Mr. Hawthorne, I wanted to mention Elena seemed upset this morning. She asked for the afternoon off, something about a family emergency." After Margaret left, Robert turned to Sarah. "She's running, or moving money," Sarah said, returning to her screens. "If they suspect you're investigating, they'll try to cover their tracks. We need to work faster." The afternoon brought a breakthrough. Sarah discovered a pattern in the offshore accounts. Regular transfers that coincided with the ghost vendor. Payments, but the money didn't stay offshore. It came back into the country through a complex series of transactions, eventually landing in accounts that, while not directly linked to his employees, showed suspicious patterns. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to her screen. "Large cash withdrawals from these accounts, always just under the reporting threshold. Medical expenses paid in cash, tuition payments, even what looks like gambling debts. Your people weren't just stealing, they were using the money for specific purposes." Robert's phone rang. It was Tom from security. "Boss, you need to see something. Can you come to the front gate?" Robert excused himself and walked quickly to the security booth at the estate's entrance. Tom was reviewing footage from the gate. "Cameras," his expression grim. "About an hour ago," Tom said, pointing to the screen. "Look who came to visit." The footage showed Elena's car at the gate, but she wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat a small figure, a little girl in a blue coat, the same child from the party. "She stayed about 20 minutes, Tom continued. "But here's the interesting part. Watch this." He fast-forwarded to Elena leaving. The car stopped just past the gate, and the little girl got out. But instead of leaving with Elena, she walked back toward the estate, slipping through the pedestrian entrance when Tom was checking a delivery truck. "She's still here?" Robert asked. "As far as I know, I've been watching for her to leave, but—" "Find her," Robert said, quietly. "Don't scare her, but find her." 20 minutes later, Tom called. "She's in the rose garden, sitting on the bench by the fountain." Robert found her exactly where Tom had said. A small figure dwarfed by the late-blooming roses around her. She looked up as he approached. No surprise on her young face. "Hello, Mr. Hawthorne," she said formally. "I've been waiting for you." Robert sat beside her, studying this child who seemed to know so much. "What's your name?" "Sophie. Sophie Graham." She pulled out a worn photograph from her coat pocket. A younger Margaret holding a baby, standing next to a man in military uniform. "That's my grandma and my daddy. He died in Afghanistan when I was 3. The pieces clicked into place. Margaret's daughter's child. The granddaughter she'd mentioned only in passing, who she said lived with other relatives. "Why did you warn?" "Me at the party, Sophie." Her small face crumpled. "Because it's wrong. Grandma taught me that stealing is wrong, but she's doing it anyway." She cries at night sometimes. She thinks I don't know, but I do. She's scared. Scared of what? Of the bills. My treatments are expensive, and insurance doesn't cover everything. She showed me once how much it costs to keep me healthy. Sophie pulled up her sleeve, revealing a medical alert bracelet. I have a rare blood disease. Grandma says she'd do anything to keep me well, but I don't want her to be a thief. Robert felt his heart constrict. The medical expenses Sarah had found, the cash withdrawals, Margaret, desperate to save her granddaughter, had crossed a line she'd probably never imagined crossing. Sophie, why were you with Eleanor today? She came to our apartment. She was really upset, telling Grandma they needed to move money right away. She said you were getting suspicious. Grandma told her it was too late, that they should confess. They argued. Elena said something about James and a plan. I snuck into her car because I wanted to come tell you everything. Tell me about the plan, Sophie. The child scrunched up her face, trying to remember. Elena said James had been moving money for months to somewhere called the Cayman Islands. She said they had enough to disappear to start over. But Grandma said she couldn't leave. She couldn't take me away from my doctors. Robert's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. You need to see this, urgently. Sophie, I need you to stay here for a few minutes. Tom is going to watch over you. Is that okay? She nodded solemnly. Are you going to arrest my grandma? I'm going. To try to fix this, Robert said, not knowing if he could keep that promise. He returned to the pool house where Sarah had pulled up a new set of records. Elena just tried to initiate a massive transfer. We're talking about moving nearly $2 million to an account in the Caymans, but she needs 2 signatures for that amount. James, Robert said, already done. His authorization came through an hour ago, but she also needs 1 more, either yours or someone with power of attorney. Margaret has limited power of attorney for household expenses. Then we have a problem. If Margaret signs off on this, the money's gone. The international banking laws make it nearly impossible to recover. Robert made a decision. Call Paul. Tell him we need law enforcement now, and have him meet us at the house. It's time to end this. As they walked back to the main house, Robert thought about the child in the rose garden, about 20 years of morning coffee, about trust betrayed and desperation driving good people to bad choices. He'd built his empire on sound judgment and careful planning. Now he had to decide if there was room in that empire for mercy. The estate looked peaceful in the afternoon light, but Robert knew that beneath the surface, his carefully constructed world was about to explode. The only question was whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. Paul arrived within the hour, accompanied by Detective Patricia Morrison from the Financial Crimes Division. They set up in Robert's study, transforming it into a war room of sorts. Sarah's laptops covered the coffee table, displaying damning evidence in stark digital clarity. The detective, a woman with steel-grey hair and knowing eyes, reviewed everything with professional detachment. Mr. Hawthorne, Detective Morrison said after an hour of examination, we have enough here for arrests and asset freezing, but I need to know, are you prepared for what comes next? These people have been part of your life for years. Before Robert could answer, Tom's voice crackled through the intercom. Boss, Margaret's heading to the study. She looks determined. Let her come, Robert said. He turned to the others. Would you step into the adjoining room? I'd like to speak with her alone first. Paul started to object, but Robert held up his hand. Please, I need to do this my way. They reluctantly moved to the connected library, leaving the door slightly ajar. Robert sat behind his desk and waited. When Margaret knocked, her signature rhythm unmistakable, he called her in. She entered carrying a manila envelope, her face pale but composed. 20 years of service had given her a dignity that even this moment couldn't entirely strip away. She placed the envelope on his desk and sat without being asked. I assume you know, she said simply. I know enough. The ghost vendors, the offshore accounts, the systematic theft going back at least 5 years. What I don't understand is why. Margaret, I would have helped you. All you had to do was ask. Margaret's composure cracked. Or would you have given me $8 million, Mr. Hawthorne? Because that's what Sophie's treatments have cost. The experimental therapies, the specialists, the drugs that insurance called experimental and refused to cover. Would you have... You paid for all that? You never gave me the chance to try. I was too proud, she admitted, tears flowing freely now. And then, after the first time, just a small amount, I told myself, just to cover one treatment. It became easier. Elena had noticed some discrepancies I'd created. Instead of reporting me, she offered to help. She had her own debts, gambling problems that had spiraled out of control. And James had made some bad investments with his personal money, trying to prove he was as smart as the man he advised. Robert opened the envelope she'd brought. Inside were bank statements, account numbers, a full confession written in Margaret's careful script, and something else, a small key. That opens a safety deposit box at First National, Margaret explained. Everything's there, all the records, all the account information. I started keeping copies 2 years ago. I knew this day would come eventually. Why didn't you run? Elena wanted you to disappear. Margaret's smile was sad. Where would I go, Mr. Hawthorne? Sophie needs her doctors here. She needs stability. And I'm tired of running from what I've done. I couldn't let her die, you understand? I watched my daughter waste away in a military hospital, helpless to save her. When Sophie got sick with the same rare condition, I swore I wouldn't be helpless again. The door to the library opened, and Detective Morrison stepped out. Mrs. Graham, I'm going to need you to come with me. Margaret stood, smoothing her skirt. With habitual precision. Sophie's in the rose garden. She knows what I've done. Please, Mr. Hawthorne, don't let her blame herself. She tried to stop me. I'll take care of Sophie, Robert promised. Margaret, did Elena and James already leave? Elena's packing. She has a flight at 8 tonight. James, I don't know, he's been harder to read lately, more desperate. He mentioned something about having one more card to play, but I don't know what he meant. After the detective led Margaret away, Paul emerged from the library. Robert, we need to move fast on the others. If they realize Margaret's been arrested. Robert's desk phone rang. The display showed James's private line. Robert hit the speaker button. James, Robert. James's voice was strained, almost manic. I assume by now you know everything. Margaret always was too sentimental for this kind of work. It's over, James. The police are already here. Not quite over. You see, I've been your financial advisor for 15 years. I know things about your empire that even you've forgotten. Hidden assets, tax shelters that skirt the legal line, deals that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. I've prepared quite a package. For the IRS and the SEC, your empire will survive, but the damage to your reputation, the investigations, the public scandal, well, that's a different kind of theft, isn't it? You're trying to blackmail me? I'm trying to negotiate. I have a simple proposal. Let me disappear. Don't pursue the money I've taken. Consider it a severance package for 15 years of making you richer. In return, my insurance policy stays buried. Detective Morrison was already on her radio, calling for units to move on James's house. But Robert knew James too well. He'd already be gone, probably calling from a burner phone. You know I can't do that, James. Then we both burn, Robert. Your choice. The line went dead. Paul immediately got on his phone to alert the airports and train stations while Detective Morrison coordinated with her team. In the midst of the chaos, Tom appeared in the doorway. Boss, the little girl is asking for you. And Elena just pulled out of the driveway, my guys following her. Robert found Sophie still in the rose garden, but now she was crying. He sat beside her, this little girl who'd shown more courage than adults, 3 times her age. Is Grandma going to jail? She asked. I don't know yet, Sophie, but whatever happens, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of. Your treatments, your doctors, I'll handle all of it. Why would you do that? We stole from you. Robert thought about how to explain complex moral choices to a child. Because your grandmother spent 20 years taking care of me and my family. She made a terrible mistake out of love for you, but that doesn't erase all the good she did. And you tried to make it right. That took incredible bravery. Tom's voice crackled through Robert's phone. Elena's at the airport. Terminal 2. State police are moving in now. Within an hour, the wheels of justice were turning with inexorable momentum. Elena was arrested at the departure gate, her luggage containing flash drives with enough evidence to support everything Margaret had confessed. The Cayman accounts were frozen. The ghost companies were exposed, but James remained a ghost himself. His house was empty, his car abandoned at a mall parking lot. The package he'd threatened Robert with hadn't surfaced yet, but the threat lingered, like a storm cloud. As evening fell, Robert stood in his study, now empty of police and investigators, looking at the space where the Régence clock should have been. It had never gone for cleaning. Sarah had found it listed on an auction site, sold months ago. The clock, like so much else, was gone. But unlike trust, it could be replaced. The question that haunted Robert as he stared at the empty mantle was whether anything could fill the void left by betrayal, or whether some losses were simply the price of wealth in a world where desperation could corrupt even the most loyal hearts. Sophie was staying with Tom's family for the night, but tomorrow, Robert would have to figure out a more permanent solution. The little girl who'd warned him deserved better than to pay for her grandmother's sins. In saving him from ignorance, she'd lost the only family she had left. The estate felt different now, emptier, despite still being fully staffed with the employees who hadn't betrayed him. Trust, once broken, left scars that no amount of money could heal. But perhaps, Robert thought, those scars could serve as reminders, not just of betrayal, but of the desperation that drove it, and the courage of a child who chose truth over family loyalty. Tomorrow would bring lawyers, investigators, and the messy business of untangling years of deception. But tonight, Robert Hawthorne sat alone in his study, wealthy beyond measure and poorer than he'd ever been. 3 days after the arrests, Robert sat in his father's old study, a smaller room he rarely used, filled with photographs and mementos from simpler times. Before him lay a collection of documents that painted a different picture of the betrayal. Employment contracts from decades past, each telling a story of desperation met with compassion. Margaret's file showed she'd come to the Hawthornes when her husband died, leaving her with a young daughter and crushing debt. William Hawthorne had not only hired her, but had advanced her 6-month salary to help her avoid foreclosure. A handwritten note in his father's script read, "Good people deserve second chances." Elena's history was more recent, but no less poignant. James had recommended her when she was fresh out of college, drowning in student loans and caring for sick parents. Her initial interview notes, in Robert's own handwriting, described her as brilliant but desperate, reminds me of myself at that age. And James, Robert found the letter his father had written recommending James 15 years ago. The man had just lost his own financial advisory firm to a partner's embezzlement, left with nothing but debt and a tarnished reputation. "He deserves a chance to rebuild," William had written. "Sometimes the best advisors are those who've lost everything and learned from it." The irony wasn't lost on Robert. His father had built this household on giving people second chances, and those same people had betrayed that legacy. Yet as he read through these old documents, he began to see a pattern that went beyond simple greed. His phone rang. Detective Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "Mr. Hawthorne, I wanted to update you on the case. Margaret Graham has been extremely cooperative. She's provided evidence that could help us recover most of the stolen funds. The district attorney is considering a plea deal, significant jail time, but not the maximum." "And Elena?" "Less cooperative. She's hired an expensive lawyer, claims she was coerced by the others. It's not holding up well against the evidence." "Any word on James?" "Nothing yet, but we've frozen enough accounts to make running difficult. He'll surface eventually. They always do." After ending the call, Robert made a decision that would have shocked his lawyers. He pulled out his personal stationery and began writing letters. One to the district attorney, one to Margaret's public defender, and one to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Judge Patricia Winters, an old family friend who now sat on the state superior court. By evening, Robert had formulated a plan that went against every piece of legal advice he'd received. He called Paul, his lawyer friend, knowing the conversation would be difficult. "You want to what?" Paul's voice rose with incredulity. "I want to meet with them. All of them, if we can find James. Not in a courtroom or a police station, but here, in my home. One last dinner. Robert, that's not how the justice system works. They've been arrested. There are procedures, protocols. I'm not trying to circumvent justice, Paul. I'm trying to understand it. These people stole from me, yes, but they also gave me years of their lives. Before I watch them go to prison, I need to know why good people made such terrible choices. And I need them to know something too. Know what? That I would have helped them, that all of this, the theft, the lies, the destruction of their lives, it was all unnecessary." Paul sighed deeply. "Even if I could arrange it, which is a big if, what's the point? The money's gone, trust is broken, lives are ruined. What could a dinner possibly accomplish?" Robert looked at the photograph on his father's desk, William Hawthorne standing with his staff at a long-ago Christmas party. Margaret young and smiling, everyone looking like the family they'd pretended to be. Closure, Paul, for all of us. It took 2 days of legal maneuvering, but Paul managed the impossible. Under strict conditions, police presence, limited time, recorded conversations, Margaret and Elena would be brought to the estate for what the court paperwork called a restorative justice meeting. James remained at large, but Robert proceeded anyway. Sophie had been staying with a foster family, but Robert arranged for her to spend the evening with Tom's family again. The child didn't need to witness what was coming. As he prepared for the dinner, Robert found himself in the wine cellar, selecting bottles with the same care he'd once taken for genuine celebrations. The 1982 Chateau Margaux he'd been saving. For his daughter's wedding, the Montrachet that Catherine had loved. These weren't just wines, they were liquid memories of better times. Mrs. Patterson, the cook who'd replaced Margaret, prepared the meal according to Robert's specific instructions. The same menu from the dinner party where he'd first hired James, where Eleanor had interviewed, where Margaret had first served as head of household. Every dish a reminder of beginnings that had led to this ending. As the sun set, Robert stood in his dining room, arranging place cards with his own hands. Margaret at his right, where she'd always insisted on serving from. Eleanor at his left, where she'd sat during countless working dinners. James's place remained set at the foot of the table, an empty chair that spoke volumes. Tom knocked on the door. "They're here, boss. You sure about this?" "No," Robert admitted. "But my father once told me that the hardest conversations are usually the most necessary. Let's find out if he was right." The door opened, and Margaret entered first, escorted by a uniformed officer who took position by the wall. She'd aged, years in days, her usual impeccable appearance replaced by a simple grey suit and the hollow eyes of someone who'd stopped sleeping. Elena followed, defiant still but with cracks showing in her armor, designer clothes replaced by conservative court attire. Her confidence dimmed but not extinguished. They stood awkwardly, uncertain, until Robert gestured to their seats. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss and not much time." As they took their places, Robert poured the wine himself, another break from protocol in a house that had run on careful rules and hidden resentments. The Margaux glowed ruby in the crystal glasses, beautiful and valuable, and ultimately just grape juice aged by time and pressure. "Before we begin," Robert said, raising his glass, "I want you to know that I've read everything. Your employment files, your histories, the records of how you came to work here. I know who you were before you became thieves. Tonight, I want to understand how one became the other." Margaret's hand shook as she reached for her glass. Elena sat rigid, staring at the untouched place setting across from her. And somewhere in the night, James remained free but trapped by his own choices, the empty chair a testament to the limits of both justice and mercy. "Let's start with the truth," Robert said. "All of it. We owe each other that much. The candles flickered in the growing darkness, casting shadows on the walls where portraits of generations of Hawthornes looked down on this last supper of a different kind of family. Outside, the estate grounds stretched into darkness, holding secrets that were finally ready to be dragged into the light. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire until Margaret set down her wineglass with a soft clink that seemed to echo through the dining room. Her hands folded in her lap, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. It started. "With a bill," she said. "One bill for Sophie's treatment that insurance denied. $12,000. I had $4,000 in savings. My entire life's emergency fund. I sold my mother's jewelry, borrowed from my sister. Still came up short. The doctor said Sophie needed the treatment within the month or we'd lose our window." Robert remained silent, watching as 20 years of composed service crumbled before him. "I told myself it was just a loan," Margaret continued, tears flowing freely now. "I created a vendor, a cleaning service that didn't exist. I was going to pay it back with my Christmas bonus. But then Sophie needed another treatment and another. Each time more expensive, each time more urgent, and I kept stealing." Elena shifted in her seat, her defiance wavering. "We all had our reasons," she said, her voice harder than Margaret's, but with cracks showing. "Mine started at a casino. One bad night turned into a bad month, turned into threats from people you don't want to owe money to. I noticed discrepancies in Margaret's accounts, not to report her, but because I recognized the pattern. I'd been considering the same thing." "So you helped each other," Robert said. "It wasn't a question." "We formed a partnership of the damned," Elena said with bitter humor. "Margaret needed technical expertise to hide the transactions better. I needed someone with system access, and then James was already stealing." Margaret interrupted. "We didn't know it at first. He'd been siphoning money to cover bad investments for 2 years before we started. When he discovered what we were doing, instead of reporting us, he offered to make it all more efficient." Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out 3 envelopes, placing one before each woman. "Open them." Inside each envelope was a single document, a ledger page in William Hawthorne's handwriting, showing personal loans he'd made to employees over the years. Margaret's 6-month advance was there. So was a loan to Elena's predecessor and dozens of others, all marked "Forgiven" in red ink. "My father believed in helping people," Robert said. "He also believed in keeping it private. These records were in his personal files, not the company books. He never wanted anyone to feel beholden." Margaret stared at the page, her tears falling onto the old paper. "I didn't know because he never told you. Just as you never told me about Sophie's treatments. Pride and silence, the Hawthorne family tradition, apparently." Elena found her voice. "Would you really have paid $8 million for Margaret's granddaughter? My gambling debts, James's investment losses? We'll never know, will we?" Robert's voice carried a weight of sadness. "But I can tell you this. I've paid more than $8 million in bonuses to investment managers who made me far less money than James did. I've donated more than your gambling debts to charities I've never visited. And Margaret," he looked at the woman who'd served his morning coffee for 2 decades, "you raised my daughter when my wife died. You were there for every crisis, every celebration. Did you really think I valued my money more than your granddaughter's life?" The room fell silent, except for Margaret's quiet sobs. Even the officers by the door seemed affected by the weight of missed opportunities and unspoken truths. "Where's James?" Elena asked suddenly. "Why isn't he here facing this?" Robert pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "He's been texting me. Threats, mostly. He has information about the family's business dealings. Nothing illegal, but embarrassing. He thinks it's leverage." As if summoned, the phone buzzed. A new message appeared. "Last chance, Robert. Wire $2 million to this account or tomorrow's headlines will be about the Hawthorne Empire's questionable practices." Elena grabbed the phone before Robert could stop her. She read the message, then did something unexpected. She laughed. "He's in Montreal. I recognize the account routing. He always talked about Montreal, how he'd retire there someday." "Elena," Margaret gasped. "What? You think I owe him loyalty? He was ready to let us take the fall while he ran. At least we're here, facing this." Robert took back his phone and forwarded the information to Detective Morrison. Then he looked at both women. "You asked what the point of this dinner was. Here it is." He pulled out 2 more documents. "Plea agreements. My lawyers think I'm insane, but I've recommended leniency to the district attorney. Community service instead of prison for Margaret, considering Sophie's needs. Supervised probation for Elena, with mandatory counseling for gambling addiction. Both." Women stared at the papers in shock. "Why?" Elena whispered. "Because my father believed in second chances. Because Sophie doesn't deserve to lose her grandmother. Because sending you to prison serves justice, but not redemption. And because—" Robert paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I've spent the last few days realizing that wealth without compassion is its own kind of poverty. You stole my money, but I stole something too, the chance to help when help was needed most." Margaret reached for the plea agreement with shaking hands. "The restitution terms? Structured payments over 10 years, interest-free, and Sophie's medical expenses will be covered by the Hawthorne Foundation going forward, legitimately this time." "I don't understand," Elena said. "We betrayed you. We stole millions. Why show mercy?" Robert stood, walking to the window that overlooked the gardens, where Sophie had waited with her terrible truth. "Because that little girl had more courage than all of us combined. She knew her grandmother was stealing, knew it might mean losing the only family she had left, but she told the truth anyway." "How can I do less?" He turned back to them. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness. Trust, once broken, can't be fully repaired. You'll never work in positions of financial responsibility again. Your crime will follow you, but you'll have the chance to rebuild, to make amends, to become the people you were before desperation drove you to these choices." The phone buzzed again. Detective Morrison. "Montreal police have James Winters in custody. He'll be extradited within 48 hours. Robert showed them the message. "He'll face justice too, though somehow I doubt he'll accept it with the grace you've shown tonight." Mrs. Patterson entered with the main course, coq au vin, the same dish that had been served the night Robert's father had hired Margaret. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. "Shall we eat?" Robert asked. "It seems a shame to waste a last meal together." They ate in relative silence, the weight of confessions and revelations settling over them like dust. Margaret barely touched her food, while Elena ate mechanically. Robert found himself remembering other dinners at this table, celebrations, holidays, the informal meals that had made them feel like family. As the evening drew to a close, the officers indicated it was time to leave. Margaret stood first, then did something unexpected. She walked to the sideboard and straightened a picture frame that was slightly askew, just as she'd done thousands of times before. "Old habits," she said with a sad smile. "The best ones are." "It's worth keeping," Robert replied. As they prepared to leave, Elena turned back. "Mr. Hawthorne, for what it's worth, you were a good employer. We forgot how to be good employees." After they left, Robert sat alone in the dining room, the empty chairs around him telling their own story. The candles had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He poured himself another glass of the Margot and raised it to the portraits of his ancestors. "To second chances," he said to the empty room, "and to the wisdom to offer them before they're stolen." The wine tasted of memory and regret, of chances missed and grace extended too late. But underneath, there was something else, the faint hint of hope that perhaps from the ashes of betrayal something better might grow. Not trust, that was gone forever, but perhaps understanding, perhaps even redemption. Tomorrow would bring James's extradition, legal proceedings, and the slow work of rebuilding. But tonight, in a dining room haunted by the ghosts of better times. Robert Hawthorne had learned that sometimes the best justice is tempered with mercy, and the greatest wealth is knowing when to let it go. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, autumn light streaming through the windows of Robert's study. He'd spent the night here, unable to face his empty bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of investigation, files, photographs, and the plea, agreements that would reshape 3 lives. Paul arrived early, looking haggard. "The DA accepted your recommendations," he said without preamble. "Margaret's deal is approved. 2 years of community service, supervised probation for 5. She'll work at the St. Mary's Soup Kitchen, the one your mother founded. Elena gets 3 years probation, mandatory counseling, and 500 hours of community service at the Financial Literacy Center downtown. And James, he's fighting extradition, but it won't hold. When he gets here, he's looking at 5 to 10 years. He won't accept a plea, says he'd rather take his chances at trial." Robert nodded, unsurprised. James had always been a gambler, even with other people's money. "What about the funds?" "Sarah's been working with the authorities. We've recovered about 6 million from the frozen accounts. The rest, some went to medical bills, some to gambling debts, some just disappeared into cash transactions we'll never trace. You'll get a detailed report by week's end." "And Sophie," Paul's expression softened. "Family Services approved your petition. She can stay with Tom's family temporarily while you establish legal guardianship. Margaret will have supervised visits once she begins her sentence." After Paul left, Robert called Tom. "Bring Sophie by this afternoon. It's time she saw her grandmother." The reunion took place in the Rose Garden, the same bench where Sophie had waited to deliver her second warning. Margaret, released on her own recognizance pending formal sentencing, looked fragile in civilian clothes, stripped of the authority her uniform had provided. Sophie ran to her, all childish concern and love. "Grandma, are you okay? Mr. Hawthorne said you can't live with me anymore, but we can still see each other. Is that true?" Margaret held her granddaughter tight, eyes meeting Robert's over the child's head. "Yes, sweetheart. I made some very bad choices, and now I have to face the consequences. But Mr. Hawthorne is making sure we can still be together, just differently." "Because you stole?" Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact in the way only children can manage. "Yes, because I stole, and stealing is wrong, no matter the reason." Sophie pulled back, studying her grandmother's face. "But you did it for me, for my medicine." "That doesn't make it right, Sophie. That's the most important lesson here. Good intentions don't excuse bad actions. Mr. Hawthorne would have helped us if I'd asked. I was too proud, too afraid, and that pride cost us everything." Robert stepped forward. "Not everything. Sophie, your grandmother will be working to help other people now, people who need food and kindness. And you'll be staying with the Bradleys, going to the same school, keeping the same doctors. We're going to make sure you have everything you need." "Will I see you too?" Sophie asked Robert. "If you'd like. I thought perhaps we could have tea. Once a week. You can tell me about school, and I can bore you with stories about business." For the first time since the party, Sophie smiled. "Can we have those little sandwiches? The ones with no crusts? I insist on it." That evening, Robert met with his senior staff, the ones who hadn't betrayed him. They gathered in the formal dining room, nervous and uncertain. 22 employees in total, from groundskeepers to kitchen staff, all wondering if their jobs were safe. "I've called you here to address the obvious," Robert began. "You've all heard what happened. 3 people I trusted betrayed that trust. The question you're all asking is, what happens now?" "Are you closing the estate, sir?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "No, but things will change. First, everyone here will receive a raise, 15%, effective immediately. Second, we're establishing an employee assistance fund. If you're struggling, if you need help, you come to me or the fund administrator. No questions, no judgment, just help." Murmurs rippled through the room. "Third, Robert continued. "We're implementing new financial controls, not because I don't trust you, but because trust without verification is naive." And finally, he paused, looking at each face. "I owe you all an apology. I created an environment where people felt they couldn't ask for help, where desperation festered in silence. That ends now." An older groundskeeper raised his hand. "Mr. Hawthorne, what about Margaret and Elena? What happens to them?" "They face legal consequences for their actions, but they'll also have the chance to rebuild. Margaret will be doing community service at St. Mary's. Elena at the Financial Literacy Center. They'll pay restitution over time. Justice, but tempered with the mercy I should have shown earlier." The meeting ended with an unusual warmth, employees understanding that the betrayal had changed their employer as much as it had changed the estate. Later that night, Robert received a call from Detective Morrison. James Winters was extradited. "This evening. He's being arraigned tomorrow. Mr. Hawthorne, he's asking to see you." "No," Robert said firmly. "James made his choice when he ran, when he tried to blackmail me. Margaret and Elena faced their actions. He chose differently. That's his burden to bear. Understood? Oh, and sir, the information he threatened you with, we've reviewed it all. It's embarrassing, sure, but nothing illegal. A few aggressive tax strategies, some hardball business tactics, nothing that would survive a news cycle." After the call, Robert walked through his house, seeing it with new eyes. The empty spaces where trust had lived, the quiet corners where desperation had hidden, the formal rooms where honesty had been sacrificed for appearances. He ended up in the kitchen, brewing tea himself, something he hadn't done in years. As he waited for the water to boil, he thought about cycles. His father had built this household. On second chances, Robert had nearly destroyed it with blind trust. Now perhaps he could rebuild it on something stronger, trust with wisdom, compassion with boundaries, grace with justice. The kettle whistled, and Robert poured the water over the tea leaves, watching them steep. Tomorrow, Sophie would come. For their first official tea, he'd need to remember about the crustless sandwiches. It seemed a small thing, but Robert was learning that small things, a child's courage, a moment's desperation, an offer of help extended or withheld, could change everything. As he carried his tea back to his study, Robert passed the empty space where the Régence clock had stood. Tomorrow he'd buy a new clock, not the same one, that was gone forever, like the trust it had marked, but something new. Something that would mark different hours, better choices, and the hope that from betrayal could come wisdom, and from wisdom, perhaps, a different kind of wealth altogether. 6 months later, spring had returned to the Hawthorne estate, bringing with it a sense of renewal that went beyond the blooming gardens. Robert stood in his study, reorganized now with new security protocols and transparent systems, reviewing the monthly reports with his new financial advisor, Dr. Patricia Chen, Sarah's colleague who'd been instrumental in uncovering the theft. "The Employee Assistance Fund has been accessed 12 times, Patricia reported. "Everything from medical emergencies to housing deposits. No one's abusing it, and productivity is actually up across the board." "Fear is a terrible motivator," Robert mused. Who knew trust and support worked better? Through the window, he could see the gardens where Tom's team worked. Margaret's old assistant had been promoted to head of household, bringing fresh ideas and an openness that Margaret's rigid efficiency had never allowed. The estate ran differently now, less like a museum, more like a home. "Mr. Hawthorne," Patricia continued, "there's one more item. Margaret Graham has submitted her first restitution payment. It's more than the required amount." Robert looked at the check. Margaret's careful handwriting on a money order for $500. $200 more than her monthly obligation. A note was attached. "The extra is for the clock. I know it can't replace the original, but I needed to try. Add it to Sophie's education fund," Robert instructed. Anonymously. At precisely 4 o'clock, Robert heard the sound he'd come to treasure, Sophie's laughter echoing through the halls as Tom's wife Janet brought her for their weekly tea. The little girl burst into the study, her school uniform slightly disheveled, her face bright with excitement. "Mr. Hawthorne, guess what? I got an A on my science project, the one about blood cells. You helped me with the research, remember?" "I remember," Robert said, settling into what had become their routine. "Congratulations, that calls for extra sandwiches." They sat in the conservatory now for their teas, surrounded by glass and light instead of the formal dining room's shadows. Sophie chattered about school, friends, her latest drawings, a child's life slowly returning to normal after upheaval. "I saw Grandma yesterday," Sophie said, suddenly serious. "At the soup kitchen. She was serving food and laughing with the people there. She looked happy. Is that weird?" "Not at all," Robert replied. "Sometimes people find purpose in unexpected places. Your grandmother is helping people who need it, and that can bring its own joy. She said she's learning things about why people end up needing help, about how easy it is to fall and how hard it is to get back up. She said you gave her a gift by not sending her to jail." "Your grandmother gave me a gift too," Robert said. "She taught me that good people can make terrible choices when they're desperate, and that if we want to prevent those choices, we need to make sure people don't get that desperate in the first place." Sophie considered this, with the gravity only children could manage. "Is that why you started the fund, the one that helps employees?" "Partly. Also because your bravery in telling the truth showed me that hiding problems only makes them worse. Now, shall we discuss your next science project?" Later, after Janet had taken Sophie home, Robert received a video call from an unexpected source. Elena, checking in as part of her probation requirements. She looked different, healthier, the desperate edge gone from her eyes. "Mr. Hawthorne," she began formally, then relaxed slightly. "I wanted to thank you. The counseling, it's helping. I haven't placed a bet in 5 months. I'm glad to hear it, Elena. How's the financial literacy center? Eye-opening. Do you know how many people are one paycheck away from disaster? How many are drowning in debt they don't understand? I've been teaching basic budgeting classes. Turns out I'm good at helping people manage money when it's not my own." They talked for a few more minutes about her progress, her plans, the slow work of rebuilding a life. After the call, Robert reflected on the strange paths redemption could take. Elena, who'd stolen to feed a gambling addiction, now taught others to avoid the trap she'd fallen into. Margaret, who'd betrayed trust for love, now served those who had neither. Even James, according to Paul's updates, was teaching financial literacy to fellow inmates while serving his sentence. That evening, Robert hosted a dinner, not in the formal dining room, but in the kitchen, with staff and their families. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a feast. Children ran between tables, and laughter filled spaces that had been silent for too long. Tom pulled Robert aside during dessert. "Boss, I've been thinking. Sophie's doing well with us, but she misses having a real home. Have you given any more thought to—" "The guardianship papers are almost finalized," Robert confirmed. "But I won't rush her. When she's ready, if she wants to, she'll have a room here, her choice, her timing." "You've changed," Tom observed. "This place has changed. We had to. The alternative was letting it all crumble under the weight of old secrets and new betrayals." As the evening wound down and families headed home, Robert found himself alone in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Patterson with the last of the dishes, something the old Robert would never have done. "You know," Mrs. Patterson said, hands deep in soapy water, "your father used to do this sometimes, late at night, when he couldn't sleep. Said it helped him think." "What did he think about?" "The weight of wealth," he called it. How money could build walls as easily as bridges, how the hardest thing wasn't making it or keeping it, but using it wisely. Robert dried a plate carefully, thinking about his father's wisdom and his own hard-learned lessons. Did he ever doubt? Wonder if he was doing the right thing every day? But he said doubt was good. It meant you were still thinking, still caring. It was certainty that worried him. People who were certain they were right never stopped to consider they might be wrong. That night, Robert stood in his study, looking at the new clock on the mantle. It wasn't as ornate as the Régence, but it kept perfect time, its steady ticking a reminder that moments passed, whether spent in trust or suspicion, generosity or fear. He pulled out a leather journal, his own version of the family ledger, but recording different transactions, not money in and out, but lessons learned, grace extended, trust rebuilt in small increments. Today's entry was simple. Sophie got an A. Margaret found purpose. Elena stayed sober. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. The estate was quieter now, but not empty. It hummed with different energy, less perfect, more human. The walls that had hidden desperation now displayed children's artwork from the staff's families. The formal spaces had been softened with comfortable furniture and open doors. As midnight approached, Robert closed the journal and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: Sophie's guardianship hearing, meetings about the employee fund, the ongoing work of rebuilding trust. But tonight, in a house transformed by betrayal and redeemed by mercy, Robert Hawthorne slept peacefully, knowing that sometimes the greatest treasure wasn't what you kept, but what you chose to give away. 1 year later, autumn had returned to the Hawthorne estate, painting the grounds in shades of gold and amber. The annual harvest party was in full swing, but this gathering bore little resemblance to the formal affair where a little girl's warning had changed everything. Children ran freely through the gardens, staff members mingled with guests as equals, and laughter came easily and genuinely. Robert stood on the terrace, watching Sophie help serve appetizers to guests. She'd grown in the past year, not just in height, but in confidence. The scared little girl who'd whispered warnings had become a cheerful child who moved through the estate as if she'd always belonged here, which in a way she had. "She's doing well," a familiar voice said beside him. Robert turned to find Margaret, looking healthier than she had in years. Her community service had ended 2 months ago, but she'd chosen to continue volunteering at the soup kitchen. "The work," she said, "gave her purpose that 20 years of perfect household management never had." "She misses you," Robert said simply, "but she understands. I see her every week. That's more than some grandmothers get." Margaret paused, watching her granddaughter laugh with other children. "I wanted to thank you again, not for the leniency, I've thanked you for that, but for Sophie, for making sure she didn't pay for my sins. She saved us all in a way." Her courage in speaking the truth started the dominoes falling. "Dominoes that needed to fall," Margaret said firmly. "I was at Elena's celebration last week. Did you know?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "Celebration?" 1 year sober from gambling. She's sponsoring others now, using her story to help people before they fall as far as she did. She wanted me to tell you she's saved enough to increase her restitution payments. Tell her to keep it, use it to build her new life. The money, it matters less than what we've all learned." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the party unfold. Tom's security team was there, but as guests now, their children playing with Sophie. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with the food, aided by a full kitchen staff who felt valued rather than invisible. Even Paul had come, bringing his family to see the estate he'd heard so much about during the legal proceedings. "I should go," Margaret said eventually. "This is your world now, not mine, but I wanted to give you this." She handed him an envelope, worn at the edges as if she'd carried it for a while. Robert opened it to find a photograph, the staff Christmas party from 3 years ago. Everyone was there. Margaret in her crisp uniform, Elena radiating ambition, James looking paternal and wise. But in the corner, almost hidden, was Sophie, peeking around a door, watching the adults with those same observant eyes that would later see too much truth. "She was always watching," Margaret said, "always understanding more than we realized. Children do that, see through our pretenses to what really matters." After Margaret left, Robert found himself in his study, now Sophie's favorite place to do homework. Her drawings covered one wall, pictures of the estate, the gardens, the people who made it home. In the center was a new addition, a family portrait she'd made for art class. It showed Robert, Sophie, and scattered around them all the people who kept the estate running. At the bottom, in Sophie's careful printing, "My family, different but real." The new Hawthorne Trust document sat on his desk, awaiting his final signature. He'd restructured everything, creating educational funds for employees' children, medical emergency reserves, and a revolutionary profit-sharing program that made every staff member a stakeholder in the estate's success. His lawyers had called it radical. His accountants had called it expensive. Robert called it insurance against desperation. "Mr. Hawthorne?" Sophie appeared in the doorway, still carrying her serving tray. "There's someone at the gate asking for you. Says his name is James." Robert's hand stilled on the papers. James had been released early for good behavior and cooperation with authorities recovering the last of the stolen funds. They hadn't spoken since his arrest. "What should I tell security?" Sophie asked, her young face serious. Robert considered for a long moment. "Tell them to let him in. But he comes to the kitchen entrance, not the front door. And Sophie, stay inside for a bit, okay?" He found James at the kitchen door, looking older, grayer, wearing a cheap suit that hung on his diminished frame. Prison had taken the polish off him, left him raw and uncertain. "Robert," James began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss. "Walk with me," Robert said, leading him away from the house toward the quiet of the rose garden. They walked in silence until they reached the bench, where Sophie had waited with her truth. James sat heavily, looking around at the grounds he'd once moved through with assumed authority. "I came to apologize," he said finally. "Not for your forgiveness, I don't deserve that, but because I needed to say it. I betrayed everything, your trust, your father's memory, my own principles. I let greed and pride poison everything good in my life." "Why?" Robert asked. "Of all of them, you I understood the least. Margaret had Sophie's medical bills. Elena had gambling debts. But you," James laughed bitterly, "ego. Pure and simple. I wanted to prove I was as smart as the millionaires I advised, that I could play their games, make their returns. When I failed and lost everything, I couldn't admit it. Stealing seemed easier than confessing I was just another failed investor trying to catch lightning in a bottle. And now I teach financial literacy to ex-cons and at-risk youth. Turns out I'm good at showing people what not to do. I use myself as a cautionary tale, the advisor who forgot the first rule of investment: don't gamble with what you can't afford to lose." They sat quietly, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of forgiveness. Finally, James stood to leave. "Robert, take care of them. Margaret and Eleanor. They were desperate. I was just greedy. There's a difference. They're taking care of themselves now. We all are in our own ways." After James left, Robert returned to the party to find Sophie looking for him. "Was that Mr. James? Grandma told me about him." "Yes. He came to apologize. Did you forgive him?" Robert considered how to explain complex moral choices to a child who'd already seen too much. "I'm working on it. Forgiveness isn't always instant, Sophie. Sometimes it's a process, like healing from being sick. It takes time, but it's worth it." "Yes," Robert said, surprising himself with the certainty. "It's worth it." As the party wound down and guests began leaving, Robert found himself in the formal dining room, now transformed into a community space where staff meetings and celebrations were held. The long table where secrets had festered now hosted honest conversations and shared meals. He pulled out his journal, nearly full now, and began writing. "1 year ago, a little girl's warning shattered the illusion of trust I'd built around myself. In losing $8 million, I found something worth far more: the wisdom to see that wealth means nothing if it builds walls instead of bridges. That trust without verification is naive, but verification without compassion is cruel." That good people can make terrible choices, and terrible choices don't always make bad people. Sophie asked me once if catching the thieves made me happy. I told her no, it made me sad. But what came after, the rebuilding and the learning, the second chances and hard-won wisdom, that brought something better than happiness. It brought understanding. The Hawthorne fortune remains vast, but it's measured differently now. Not just in dollars and holdings, but in the children who'll go to college because their parents work here. In the medical emergencies that won't become financial disasters. In the small daily acts of trust that, accumulated over time, build something stronger than what betrayal destroyed. Tomorrow, Sophie officially becomes my ward, not to replace what she lost, but to build something new. Margaret will be there, and Eleanor, and even Tom's family who sheltered her when she needed it most. We're a strange family, bound by broken trust and careful redemption, but perhaps that makes us more real than the perfect household we pretended to be before. Robert closed the journal and walked to the window, looking out at the estate grounds. The Regence clock was gone forever, sold to pay for someone's desperation. But time moved forward anyway, measured now in smaller victories and grander purposes. Sophie appeared beside him, slipping her small hand into his. "Are you happy, Mr. Hawthorne?" He looked down at the child who'd saved him with 5 simple words, who'd chosen truth over family loyalty, who'd shown more courage than adults 3 times her age. "Call me Robert," he said, "or if you're ready, something else. And yes, Sophie, I'm happy. Not perfect, not complete, but happy. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for." "I think I'd like to call you Grandpa, Robert," she said quietly. "If that's okay, since I already have a grandma, and you're kind of like a grandpa who teaches me about business and makes sure I have what I need." "I'd be honored," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. As the last light faded from the sky, they stood together, the millionaire and the little girl who'd warned him. The grandfather by choice and the granddaughter by chance. Behind them, the estate settled into evening routines, its halls no longer hiding secrets but hosting hopes. The autumn party was over, but the real celebration of trust rebuilt, lessons learned and families redefined would continue long after the last guest had gone home. In the house where betrayal had once threatened to destroy everything, something better had grown, a different kind of wealth, measured in wisdom and mercy, in second chances and small hands holding tight to larger ones, in the courage to speak, truth and the grace to transform it into something beautiful. The Hawthorne fortune had survived, but more importantly, so had their humanity, and in the end, that was worth more than all the stolen millions in the world.